Hey guys, tonight we wake up in a world that smells faintly of smoke, wood, and something that might be yesterday's breakfast, or yesterday's breakfast plus the neighbor's goat. You trudge out of a low-ceiling timber hut, feeling every plank of the floor creak under your bare feet. Outside, the sun barely peeks over the horizon, brushing the thatched roofs with a soft, gold-pale light that doesn't do much to hide the grime. Your nose twitches. You realize almost immediately that you probably wouldn't survive this. Not for a day, not even for an hour. But we'll try anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious how different mornings look for everyone. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge outside, shivering slightly from the damp morning air. The village is stirring. A few chickens scratch the mud outside your door, their clucks strangely cheerful in this otherwise grim setting. A horse's hooves clomp lazily across the main path, raising a tiny cloud of dust that settles on your sleeve. And you inhale deeply, realizing that every breath carries more than just cool morning air. It's scented with manure, smoke from nearby hearths, and the faintly sweet stink of spoiled food. Historians still argue whether people truly adapted to these smells or if they simply ignored them out of necessity. But your senses are screaming in ways that modern noses wouldn't believe. You notice your neighbors already up, some washing themselves in a bucket of cold water, others sweeping the mud from the doorway while shouting at pigs that think the street is theirs. There's no alarm clock here, just the crow of roosters and the occasional shout. In this world, waking up is less about gradual stretching and coffee and more about a cold slap from reality. Your bladder needs emptying, your stomach is rumbling, and there's someone, probably your sibling, already eyeing you for the morning scuffle over firewood. You stumble toward your morning task, reminding yourself that even the simplest actions, lifting a pail, lighting a hearth, avoiding a cow stepping on your foot, require care and attention. The sun climbs slowly. You trudge past a well where the water is murky and smells faintly of algae and maybe last week's laundry. Villagers gather, talking in low, urgent tones about crops, debts, and the latest rumor that the blacksmith's apprentice may have stolen something again. You nod along, pretending to understand the nuances of their concerns, while secretly wondering why your ancestors didn't invent sneakers, or at least some gloves. You probably won't survive this, yes, but for a moment you marvel at how life persists here, stubbornly and often painfully, despite the dirt, cold, and constant minor injuries. There's a smell wafting from a neighbor's hut, smoky, bitter, almost sweet. You wrinkle your nose and realize it's not incense or bread, it's them trying to cook porridge on a fire that refuses to behave. French historians suggest some households deliberately added odd herbs, animal fat, or even soot to flavor their porridge, a claim that makes your modern breakfast cereal feel like a gourmet delight. You trudge past, imagining what it would take to live like this daily, every day. Your stomach protests, your muscles twinge, and you can almost hear your 21st century self screaming, "Nope, not today." Even the morning chores are a test. You bend to sweep the yard, lifting straw mats and discovering a treasure trove of dirt, feathers, and who knows what. Rats scuttle underfoot, and you swear one of them pauses just to mock you. Historians still argue whether villagers had practical ways to control rodents or if the rats were simply tolerated as part of the ecosystem. Meanwhile, you begin to understand how medieval people developed surprisingly tough constitutions. You, on the other hand, are just beginning to realize that soft beds and indoor plumbing were not optional luxuries. They were survival tools your ancestors didn't get to enjoy. The sun inches higher, and the village wakes fully. The blacksmith bangs a hammer in a rhythm that feels almost musical, except it's loud enough to make you wince.
Children chase each other through the muddy lanes, their laughter mingling with the bray of donkeys and the occasional bark of a stray dog. You breathe it all in, trying not to gag on the layered smells, while thinking about the fact that medieval mornings included not just chores, but a constant unspoken threat of injury, disease, or starvation. You probably won't survive this. Yet somehow, villagers move through their day with a mix of grim determination and small bursts of humor. By the time the first tasks are complete, your muscles ache, your lungs are gritty from the smoke, and your stomach rumbles with anticipation. You glance at the horizon, realizing that the rest of the day awaits. Chores, meals that may or may not kill you, strange local customs, and the very real possibility of a minor injury turning into a crisis. This is just the dawn, and already you are learning lessons in endurance, patience, and an appreciation for modern plumbing. But somehow, amid the filth, the noise, and the biting cold, there's a rhythm here, a way that life persists even when it seems absurdly difficult.
You trudge toward the communal hearth, the smell of yesterday's porridge lingering like a reminder of just how low medieval breakfasts could go. Today, you are offered the usual fare, a bowl of thin gruel, grayish and suspiciously lumpy, perhaps boiled oats or barley, occasionally dotted with a few dried berries if your luck is decent. You poke at it with a wooden spoon, thinking that your modern cereal, with its sugar, milk, and cartoon mascots, suddenly feels like a Michelin star breakfast. Historians still argue whether this gruel was actually nutritious or just a placeholder until the mid-morning snack, if anyone had one. And you, staring at this uninviting mush, understand why some medieval peasants might have considered eating worms or insects a delicacy in comparison. The villagers around you eat silently, except for the occasional muttered complaint about the porridge's consistency, or the fact that the milk ration was skimpy. You try to imitate them, lifting the spoon with solemnity, but your gag reflex almost betrays you. Fringe historians have claimed that some households added ash or powdered brick to the mix to make it heartier, a practice that makes you seriously reconsider every decision that led you here. Still, you slurp, because refusing a meal in a medieval village is basically the fastest way to get social death and possibly literal starvation. You notice a neighbor dipping their bread into the same gray mush, clearly trying to make it edible. The bread itself is a tough, coarse slab, barely risen, tasting like sawdust mixed with a hint of smoke. You take a tentative bite and immediately think of every chewy cracker you've ever hated, then multiply that by 10. Scholars still debate whether medieval bread was eaten primarily for sustenance or as a utensil for soup, a way to scoop up whatever liquid or porridge you could get. You swallow carefully, silently cursing the ancestors who decided yeast was optional. Around you, children pick at the food, some cleverly hiding morsels to trade later for a stolen apple or a scrap of cheese. You notice a goat tied near the hearth, eyeing everyone suspiciously, likely waiting for an opportunity to snatch an unattended meal. You remember that in some medieval regions, goats were fed scraps from the family table, which today might seem cute, but at the time, that goat's survival instincts could easily turn your breakfast into a duel of wills. And as you chew, you can't help but appreciate that despite all this, medieval people were hardy enough to thrive, or at least survive, on food that makes modern ramen look gourmet. As the morning unfolds, your stomach grumbles and complains loudly. You trudge outside to fetch water from the well, hoping the fresh, cold liquid will wash down the gray paste you just ingested. There, you overhear a heated argument between two villagers about whose turn it is to repair the fence, both waving hands muddy from the previous day's chores.
Fringe historians note that medieval disputes over food, labor, and property were sometimes resolved by physical contests or bizarre local customs, a thought that makes you wonder how much diplomacy really existed beyond the occasional angry shove.
A few daring neighbors walked barefoot to fetch more milk from the nearby cows, while others sharpened tools for the day's work. You trudge behind them, balancing your bowl like it contains liquid gold. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen you read about last week? Well, here you're balancing gruel and straw-strewn mud. It feels almost equally hazardous. And you realize, with a sinking stomach, that breakfast is only the first test in a day designed to weed out the weak. You glance around at the communal kitchen setup with its hanging meat, smoky cauldron, and an array of herbs that may or may not be edible. Some villagers casually toss in twigs or leaves, believing it will improve flavor, while others swear it wards off illness. Historians still argue whether these culinary practices were based on empirical evidence or superstition, but to you, it feels like a gamble every time you lift your spoon. One wrong bite, and you could end up doubled over in pain. Or worse, facing an intestinal adventure you definitely didn't sign up for. Eventually, you finish what you can stomach and stand, wiping your lips with the back of your sleeve, and realize something vital. Medieval mornings are not about enjoyment or taste. They're about function, survival, and the faint hope that you don't poison yourself before lunch. You glance at the villagers who seem perfectly calm, laughing softly as if this gruel is the finest delicacy in all Christendom, and you silently concede that your 21st century sensibilities are utterly useless here.
After that cheerful breakfast, which you almost regret finishing, you step outside fully into the medieval street, immediately reminded that surviving filth and disease is basically an unspoken morning ritual. The cobblestone lanes are slick with mud, animal droppings, and whatever else has accumulated overnight. You carefully pick your way past puddles that might hide shards of pottery or worse, while chickens, pigs, and the occasional goat wander freely, leaving a trail of gifts in their wake. Historians still argue whether these open streets were tolerated for efficiency or simply because controlling animals was too much trouble, but your modern sensibilities are revolting just looking at it. You pass a public latrine, if you can call it that, near the town square, a simple wooden bench over a trench that no one has bothered to clean in days. The smell hits instantly, a pungent mixture of ammonia, rotting straw, and something you hope isn't human. Fringe historians sometimes suggest that medieval people adapted a kind of olfactory immunity, but your nose rebels immediately, and you quietly wonder if breathing through your mouth would be safer. You try to sidestep the worst spots, but stepping carefully in mud and feces is easier said than done. You probably wouldn't last a day here. As you navigate further, rats scurry across your path, some braver than others, darting toward scraps of discarded food. You realize these little creatures are not just nuisances, they are vectors of disease, carriers of plague, typhoid, and a whole array of medieval horrors that modern medicine has thankfully tamed. Scholars still argue how much the average villager understood about contagion versus superstition, but you know one thing: touching a rat, even accidentally, could have catastrophic consequences. You jump aside as one brushes your ankle, silently promising yourself that modern pest control is vastly underrated. Along the streets, you see signs of minor injuries everywhere. A child cries with a scraped knee, someone limps past with a bandaged hand, and a villager mutters about a burn from the forge. Life is gritty and relentless here. There's no room for whining. Remember that gruel you barely survived? Well, one bad scrape or infection could ruin your day, or your week, or your life. You're already starting to understand how medieval hygiene, or the lack thereof, shaped everything from clothing choices to social behavior. You pass a woman tending her herb garden, carefully clipping leaves for poultices, ointments, or cooking. Some herbs smell faintly pleasant, but others are sharp, almost medicinal, and you wonder whether they mask illness or prevent it. Fringe historians sometimes suggest that medieval people adapted a kind of olfactory immunity, but your body can't help but back away as you imagine the burning sensation of drugs like mercury or sulfur. Then there's the plague of flies. They buzz relentlessly, settling on exposed skin, food, and clothing. You swat and flinch, remembering a lecture you once heard about how insects transmitted disease in ways medieval people couldn't quite comprehend. Historians still argue whether villagers understood enough to protect themselves effectively, or if they simply shrugged and accepted it as fate. You pause, trying to swat one particularly persistent fly, realizing your hands are already grimy from holding the water pail and the edges of the muddy street. You probably wouldn't survive a day with this level of constant exposure.
Nearby, someone dumps the contents of a chamber pot into the street, and you jump back instinctively, nearly slipping on the slick mixture. You remember reading about medieval sanitation practices that included open drains, shared wells, and sporadic street cleaning, which mostly meant shoving filth to the edges and hoping for rain. Fringe historians speculate about the mental fortitude required to exist daily in this environment. You feel your modern sensibilities quivering with every whiff. Even your clothing isn't safe. Dust, mud, and who knows what else cling to your tunic and leggings. Every touch carries a risk. Every hand-to-mouth movement might introduce bacteria into your system. Scholars still debate how much medieval people relied on daily washing versus tolerance, but your 21st century self already knows you would have failed this hygiene exam spectacularly. You consider fashion briefly. A linen tunic or woolen cloak might protect you from cold, but it won't protect you from invisible microbes lurking everywhere. By the time you reach the main square, your senses are assaulted on all fronts. Sounds of animals, smells of decay, and sights of crowds bustling past without a second thought. A merchant curses loudly at a pig who stole a loaf of bread, while a child runs through muck with bare feet, giggling. You inhale the chaos, feeling both awe and horror. You probably won't survive this, but you also marvel at the sheer resilience of people who treated filth, disease, and danger as just another part of daily life. And so, as the morning drags toward midday, you trudge onward, realizing that surviving filth and disease is not just a matter of luck. It's a combination of instinct, caution, and perhaps an invisible layer of stubborn medieval immunity that modern humans lack. You wipe your hands on a rag that has seen better centuries, shake your head at the insects that land everywhere, and steel yourself for what comes next, work that will absolutely break your back, if you're lucky enough to live that long.
By mid-morning, your legs ache from navigating the mud-choked streets, and your arms are sore from hauling water and firewood. The next challenge waits, work that breaks your back. You trudge toward the fields, past the clamor of the marketplace and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The air smells faintly of manure and wet soil, a reminder that agriculture is the backbone of survival here. Historians still argue whether peasant laborers were more efficient than they appear, or whether sheer exhaustion masked productivity. But you already know that the effort alone would humble most modern office workers. You grab a hoe or a spade, its handle rough against your palms, and begin digging into the earth. The soil is stubborn, full of stones, roots, and who knows what else. Each swing sends shivers through your back, and your knees scream in protest. You glance around and see other villagers performing equally exhausting tasks, bending over rows of crops, carrying buckets of water to distant plots, or hauling heavy sacks filled with grain. Fringe historians suggest some medieval laborers may have done multiple full-body work sessions before breakfast, a concept so alien you briefly wonder whether these people were made of iron or just masochistic. As you dig, sweat runs down your forehead, mixing with the grime already coating your face. The sun is climbing, but there's no shade for miles. You notice a few villagers who have mastered a rhythmic sway, an almost meditative cadence that makes the back-breaking work slightly bearable. You try to imitate them but quickly fail. Your arms tremble, your grip slips, and the spade clangs against a buried rock, startling a nearby chicken into a squawking flight. You probably wouldn't survive this pace for a full day, let alone the longer weeks of the medieval agricultural calendar. Occasionally, a horse-drawn cart rumbles past, loaded with hay or firewood. You step aside, squinting through the dust cloud and hoping the driver notices your presence. Fringe historians have argued that working alongside animals required both skill and constant vigilance. One misstep, and you could be trampled, dragged, or otherwise embarrassed in front of the village. You think of your 21st century self and shiver. Sitting at a desk has never felt so luxurious. Your stomach grumbles again, a faint reminder of the morning's gruel. But there's no time to eat. The work demands full attention. You lift a heavy sack of harvested grain, feeling it tear at your shoulders, and you remind yourself that even a minor miscalculation could result in injury. A twisted ankle, a bruised shoulder, or worse, a tool slipping and cutting your hand would change your day from exhausting to catastrophic. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants saw injuries as inevitable occupational hazards or avoidable through clever technique. But from your aching body, it feels inevitable. Nearby, children carry smaller loads, mimicking adults with impressive determination. Some wear simple tunics, their bare feet coated in mud, and they move with the surprising agility of youth. You marvel at their endurance. You, by contrast, are breathing heavily and wiping sweat from your brow. Fringe historians suggest that child labor was essential to family survival, a concept that makes you grateful for labor laws and public education. You probably wouldn't last a day if this were your permanent routine.
A few women pass with baskets of harvested vegetables, balancing them expertly on their hips or heads. You watch enviously, thinking of the grace required to multitask in such conditions. Meanwhile, the village elder supervises with a keen eye, occasionally barking orders that you barely understand. You notice he carries a long staff, not just for authority, but likely for protection against errant livestock or humans who push boundaries. Scholars still debate whether these elders wielded real power or merely social influence. But to you, his presence is simultaneously intimidating and oddly comforting. By late morning, your hands are blistered, your shoulders scream, and your back feels as if it might snap in half. Yet, despite the exhaustion, there's a rhythm to the labor, a sense that the community depends on your efforts, that survival is communal. You glance at the horizon, already anticipating the midday sun and the small, perhaps unsafe meal that might follow. You probably wouldn't survive this daily grind without a few centuries of conditioning, but you can't help but admire the sheer perseverance of people who did it year after year, season after season. Even as the work drags on, you start noticing the small quirks of the day. A crow stealing seeds, a neighbor singing a simple tune to make the labor feel lighter, or the gentle sway of crops in the breeze. Fringe historians often mention how people found subtle joys amidst toil, and now you see it firsthand. Still, you grit your teeth and continue, aware that medieval work is relentless, punishing, and utterly non-negotiable. Every day demands your sweat, your strength, and your survival instincts, qualities you are only just beginning to summon.
By mid-afternoon, your body aches from labor, but your lessons in town rules and odd laws are just beginning. As you trudge back toward the village center, you notice a small crowd gathered near the notice board, a simple wooden plank nailed to a post, but here it holds the power to make or break your day. You squint at the list of local ordinances, Curfews, fines for letting pigs wander, restrictions on cutting down trees, and instructions about how many loaves of bread you can sell per week. Historians still argue whether these regulations were enforced strictly or selectively, but just reading them makes you feel like a rookie about to fail medieval civics. A man shouts at a neighbor for not wearing the proper badge that indicates his guild membership, and you realize even minor infractions can attract attention or penalties. French historians suggest that some of these guild rules were as much about social hierarchy as practical governance, and you start understanding why peasants and merchants often kept an eye on one another. Because in a village, a small mistake could spiral into social humiliation or monetary loss. You glance down at your own tunic and wonder whether your modern fashion choices would have cost you a fine or public scolding. Moving past the notice board, you nearly trip over a woman who is publicly chastised for washing clothes in the stream after sunset. Apparently, there is a rule against polluting the waterway at night, and failing to comply earns both a fine and a pointed lecture. You probably wouldn't survive here, considering you've already inadvertently broken at least 3 laws by walking barefoot through mud, grubbing in the fields, and ignoring guild distinctions. Scholars still argue whether these laws truly improved village life or served primarily to reinforce authority and social norms. The local market square has its own peculiarities. A man loudly warns that if anyone takes produce without paying, the punishment is public shaming. You watch as a young boy fumbles with the loaf of bread, caught between hunger and fear of reprimand. Fringe historians sometimes claim that medieval justice was less about fairness and more about spectacle, making examples of minor offenders to enforce social cohesion. You take a cautious step back, suddenly hyper-aware of how every movement, glance, or misstep could be interpreted as law-breaking. Some laws border on the absurd. For example, a village statute prohibits singing too loudly before dawn or after dusk, believed to disturb neighbors and the local livestock. You chuckle quietly, hard not to, but the villager who explains this law has a grave look, making you wonder whether joking about regulations would earn you a public flogging. Historians still argue whether these seemingly arbitrary ordinances were genuinely enforced or were mostly deterrent threats, but you have no desire to test that theory firsthand. Nearby, a group of children play a game that involves pretending to be medieval officials enforcing fines, mimicking the adult world with eerie accuracy. You watch them chase one another around, occasionally shouting, "Pay the toll!" or "Off to the stocks!" Fringe historians suggest that even play served as a method of socialization, teaching younger generations the intricacies of laws they would soon be expected to obey. You probably wouldn't survive this environment without learning the rules fast, or at least faking compliance convincingly.
You notice a baker angrily measuring portions of dough for loaves, muttering about the new law limiting how much bread a household can bake for personal sale. These odd regulations illustrate the balance between subsistence, commerce, and authority. Scholars still debate whether controlling bread production was primarily an economic necessity or a method of social control. But watching him struggle makes you realize that breaking even a minor regulation could cause a cascade of problems, from fines to hungry neighbors complaining. A woman is escorted by 2 men toward a small platform, the stocks, for gossiping about her neighbor's laundry habits. You wrinkle your nose, partly from the spectacle and partly from the pungent air that clings to the wooden frame. Fringe historians argue about the effectiveness of public humiliation as a deterrent, but your modern self wonders how anyone maintained dignity under these conditions. You probably wouldn't last a single day without accidentally attracting similar scrutiny. Even seemingly trivial behaviors carry consequences. Picking herbs without permission, wearing a cloak of the wrong color, or lighting a fire in a forbidden area can earn fines or punishments. You walk cautiously, aware that your every action is under surveillance.
even if only by your own paranoid imagination. Historians still debate whether villagers internalized these rules out of genuine belief or simple fear, and you can feel that tension creeping into your posture with every step. By late afternoon, you are exhausted, mentally and physically. Yet the laws and peculiar local customs have taught you an important lesson. Survival in medieval times requires not just strength and endurance, but careful attention to the social and legal web that governs every interaction. You probably wouldn't survive a day if you ignored these regulations, but you slowly begin to appreciate the strange balance of order, chaos, and human ingenuity that allowed villages to function despite the hardships.
You move on toward the marketplace, where the chaos intensifies. Here, survival isn't just about hygiene or laws, it's about wits, reflexes, and the uncanny ability to navigate a bustling crowd without losing your fingers, your wallet, or your dignity. Merchants shout their wares, sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, smoked fish, and odd trinkets made of bone or clay. The smell hits you first, a heady mix of smoke, animal fat, and spoiled produce. Fringe historians argue whether markets were organized efficiently or if they thrived purely on controlled chaos. But your senses scream at you that only the alert survive. You weave carefully between carts, balancing a basket of goods while dodging chickens, children, and stray dogs. Someone drops a fish, and the slick scales coat the cobblestones. Slipping here could mean a humiliating tumble, perhaps in front of the entire village. Historians still debate whether market-goers consciously practiced pedestrian survival skills or simply learned through painful trial and error. You probably wouldn't survive the first hour without becoming part of the day's entertainment. The merchants themselves are colorful characters. A fishmonger loudly boasts about the freshness of his catch while flicking water at competitors. A potter smirks as she places her wares just out of reach, forcing eager children to negotiate or beg. Fringe historians suggest that these exaggerated performances weren't just sales tactics, they reinforced social hierarchies and community norms. You watch, amused, but also aware that accidentally offending a vendor could result in anything from a curse to an impromptu chase through the market. A man hawks a curious contraption that looks like a wooden bird cage with wheels. He claims it wards off evil spirits from your home if you pay a small fee. You raise an eyebrow, thinking about modern home gadgets and the human tendency to believe in convenient magic. Historians still argue whether such items were largely symbolic, practical, or just plain exploitative. But you note the gleam in his eyes and realize that clever merchants knew how to capitalize on fear and superstition as expertly as any Wall Street trader today. Children dart between stalls, sneaking fruit or shiny trinkets while their parents barter with the sellers. Fringe historians note that youthful thievery was often tolerated as a learning experience, though sometimes it earned a sharp public reprimand. You find yourself watching nervously as a boy grabs an apple and narrowly avoids a vendor's broom, your heart racing not just for him, but for your own sanity, imagining doing the same. You probably wouldn't last a day without learning these unspoken survival strategies. The marketplace smells like everything and nothing at once. Spices imported from faraway lands, pungent cheese left in the sun, roasted meat that's just edible enough to tempt you, and of course, layers of mud, manure, and sweat. You step carefully, balancing curiosity with caution, remembering that a simple misstep can ruin your day. Historians still debate the hygiene of markets versus their necessity for community sustenance, but you already suspect that organized chaos might be the most accurate description.
Then, a street performer catches your attention. A man juggling flaming torches while reciting exaggerated stories about heroic hunts and battles. Fringe historians suggest that public performances like this were as much about community entertainment as subtle political commentary. And you can't help but admire the skill while thinking how dangerous it would be to mess up the timing of a juggling torch. Your survival instincts scream in silent warning. Admire, but do not intervene. Food stalls tempt you, but caution restrains your curiosity. Some villagers sample meat that looks freshly smoked, while others are less fortunate, nibbling on hard bread or the occasional stale cheese. Historians still argue whether medieval people developed stronger immune systems from exposure to microbes or whether luck alone spared most from constant foodborne illness. You probably wouldn't survive sampling anything without a minor gastrointestinal revolt. Nearby, a man offers a curious concoction, a brownish paste claiming to cure fatigue and improve strength. Fringe historians note that such tonics were often a mix of herbs, animal fats, and superstition, and could just as easily weaken you as help. You shake your head, silently relieved that modern energy drinks are a safer gamble, and trudge on, trying not to trip over the tangle of feet, carts, and mud. By late afternoon, the marketplace has taught you subtle skills, how to navigate chaos, interpret human behavior, and weigh risk against reward. You probably wouldn't survive without this awareness. And yet, amidst the noise, the smells, and the occasional near accident, there is a strange rhythm, a pulse of medieval life that is exhausting, thrilling, and oddly mesmerizing. You trudge onward, ready to explore the next challenge, medieval medicine, where danger isn't just in the environment, but often comes with a friendly face and a shiny set of tools.
By late afternoon, your stomach is still rumbling, your back protests, and you reluctantly realize it's time to confront medieval medicine. You trudge toward a small wooden hut marked with a faded red cross, or what passes for one in this village. Inside, the air smells of herbs, smoke, and something faintly metallic that makes your stomach churn. You watch as the local healer hovers over a patient, mixing powders and ointments in a way that seems more theatrical than scientific. Historians still argue whether these early medical practices truly extended life expectancy or simply offered comfort while disease ran its course. You observe curious implements, a set of knives, a few cupping vessels, and something that looks suspiciously like a bent iron rod. Fringe historians claim that some of these tools were multifunctional, used for both treatment and ritualistic purposes. You probably wouldn't survive a day here without keeping your distance, because even a minor cut or scrape could lead to an appointment with the healer and experience equal parts fascination and terror. A villager groans as the healer applies leeches to their arm. You wrinkle your nose at the wriggling, sticky creatures and think about the absurdity of modern bloodletting remedies. Historians still debate whether leeches were genuinely therapeutic or mostly symbolic, but watching them drain a few ounces of blood is enough to convince your modern self that skipping medical appointments might be safer, though perhaps less effective. The healer mumbles incantations while grinding dried herbs into a paste, occasionally sprinkling a few drops of wine on the mixture. Fringe historians suggest that blending superstition and practical treatment may have actually improved outcomes in some cases, but your instincts scream caution. You probably wouldn't last a day here without flinching at every poke, prodding, and unexplained smell. Nearby, a small shelf holds jars of mysterious substances, powders that promise to cure headaches, mixtures that claim to repel evil spirits, and strange balms that allegedly ease toothaches. You pick up a jar labeled Dragon's Breath Salve, and the healer gives you a warning glance, as if you're about to summon mythical creatures. Historians still argue whether the naming of remedies was primarily psychological,
meant to instill hope or fear, and you silently admire the marketing savvy. A young apprentice is nervously carrying a bowl of hot water, likely intended for a poultice or perhaps a makeshift sterilization attempt. Fringe historians note that apprentices were often subjected to trial and error on real patients, a thought that makes your modern ethics class real. You probably wouldn't survive this learning curve without at least one minor incident that makes everyone scream and flail. The healer beckons you closer and offers a curious tonic, claiming it strengthens the spirit and wards off minor fevers. You peek at the contents, a murky brown liquid that smells faintly of vinegar, herbs, and something you hope isn't fermented goat milk. Historians still debate whether these tonics actually had medicinal properties or were placebo mixed with superstition, but your instincts scream, "Don't drink it." French historians note that even in failure, these concoctions sometimes accidentally helped, either through herbal properties or the body's natural resilience.
A nearby patient receives a bloodletting treatment, the healer making careful, precise cuts while chanting in a low, rhythmic tone. You flinch, imagining every step and thinking that even the gentlest procedure could go horribly wrong. You probably wouldn't survive the exposure to blood-borne pathogens or the risk of infection alone. Yet there's a strange rhythm to the ritual, a dance between human skill and the merciless limitations of medieval knowledge. Outside, you notice villagers arriving from minor ailments, headaches, fevers, scraped knees. Some receive ointments, others just a stern lecture, while a few are quietly sent home with nothing but herbal advice. Fringe historians suggest that this variation in care might reflect both practical knowledge and social hierarchy. You realize that survival depends not only on avoiding disease, but also on understanding the social dynamics of treatment, who gets help first and who must wait, possibly at great risk. By the time you leave the healer's hut, your senses are overwhelmed. The smells, the sight of wriggling leeches, and the constant hum of chanting all contribute to the realization that medieval medicine is a daily gamble. You probably wouldn't survive a day relying on these remedies alone, yet you also marvel at the ingenuity, creativity, and persistence of people who tried to treat sickness with nothing but observation, superstition, and a handful of herbs. It's exhausting, fascinating, and slightly terrifying. Exactly what you expected from a world that challenges every modern comfort you take for granted.
As evening approaches, you find yourself drawn toward the noble courts, where the stakes shift from mud, leeches, and rotting porridge to etiquette, intrigue, and subtle danger. The manor looms ahead, a stone structure with high windows, tapestries flapping faintly in the breeze, and guards who watch your every step with mild suspicion. You trudge through the courtyard, aware that misstepping here could be socially fatal. Historians still argue whether the rigid codes of noble behavior were genuinely functional or simply theatrical displays of hierarchy, but you already feel that the slightest faux pas might earn a snide remark, or worse. Inside, the air is warm, perfumed faintly with beeswax, incense, and the delicate tang of preserved meats. The nobles glide past in fine clothes, jeweled belts, and elaborate headgear. You clutch your modest tunic tighter, aware that your peasant attire makes you stick out like a sore thumb. Fringe historians claim that some nobles actually appreciated the honest laborers who brought goods or services to the court, yet you suspect your presence is mostly tolerated rather than welcomed. You probably wouldn't survive a day here without mastering the intricate dance of politeness and invisibility. You witness a minor dispute between two courtiers over seating arrangements at a low table. The argument is subtle,
raised eyebrows, sharp glances, whispered accusations, but potentially ruinous if a lord interprets the body language incorrectly. Historians still argue whether such conflicts were genuine power struggles or elaborate social performances, but you can't help observing how every movement is laden with consequence. You probably wouldn't last a day without accidentally offending someone powerful enough to ruin your life, or at least your reputation. A servant passes with a tray of wine and bread, moving gracefully while avoiding eye contact with the high-ranking nobles. Fringe historians suggest that such rituals trained everyone in the household to prioritize discretion, humility, and subtlety, qualities that feel exhausting even to watch. You imagine yourself tripping over the tray and spilling wine on the Lord's robes, immediate social death. Your modern reflexes shiver at the thought of causing chaos with a simple misstep. Nearby, a minstrel strums a lute, attempting to entertain without offending the Lord's sensibilities. You notice the subtle signals between performers and their audience, a barely perceptible nod of approval, a half smile, a polite cough. Historians still argue whether medieval entertainment was primarily art or survival, a blend of performance and social navigation. Fringe historians go further, noting that minstrels often conveyed secret messages or gossip under the guise of song. You probably wouldn't survive the subtle complexity of this social tightrope, but you marvel at their dexterity and courage. You overhear whispers about alliances, marriages, and property disputes, each spoken in tones measured for maximum discretion. One misheard word, a wrong glance, or an unintended comment could tip the balance of favor in unexpected ways. Historians suggest that such intrigue was both a method of governance and a form of sport, a delicate balancing act of human ambition. You probably wouldn't last a day navigating these invisible lines of power without stepping on someone's toes or ego.
A young noble approaches a scholar with a stack of parchment, debating the correctness of a contract. The conversation is polite yet charged, every word a potential trap. Historians still debate whether literacy and legal knowledge genuinely empowered the lower ranks of society or merely reinforced elite dominance. But you feel the tension in the room, and your back stiffens as if anticipating a duel over words. Fringe historians note that observing these interactions could be an education in diplomacy, but only if you survive to tell the tale. You watch servants carrying trays with delicacies you could never hope to taste: sugared almonds, spiced wine, roasted fowl. The scents are tantalizing yet almost cruel, a reminder of the gulf between social strata. Historians still argue whether the display of excess was meant to impress, intimidate, or merely amuse the nobles themselves, and you silently wish for a humble loaf of bread instead. You probably wouldn't survive a day in the court without being hyper-aware of appearances, etiquette, and the ever-present potential for scandal. Finally, evening shadows stretch across the hall. Candles flicker, casting elongated shapes on stone walls, and the air grows heavier with whispered secrets. Fringe historians suggest that nightfall within the court was a time when subtle power plays intensified, and even trusted allies could become rivals under dim light. You probably wouldn't survive this world of elegance, subtext, and ever-present social hazards, but observing it leaves you in awe. This is a universe where survival isn't just about muscles or food. It's about cunning, perception, and constant vigilance. By the time you leave the noble court, your mind reels from the subtle dangers, calculated gestures, and layered intrigue. You trudge back toward the village, aware that darkness will soon bring its own trials, where predators and superstition rule, and the lessons of daylight may only partially protect you.
Night falls gradually, casting long, wavering shadows across the village streets. You trudge through the dimming alleys, the air suddenly cooler, but heavy with the combined scent of animals, smoke, and damp earth.
Torches flicker in front of homes, creating dancing shapes on mud-splattered walls. Historians still argue whether nighttime in medieval villages was inherently dangerous or merely perceived that way by anxious observers. But your instincts tell you to pay attention. Darkness amplifies risk, and everything looks different under muted light. You hear distant barking and the soft shuffle of hooves against cobblestones. Someone is carrying a lantern, probably returning from a late trip to the well or the fields. Fringe historians note that light sources were both practical and symbolic, providing safety but also reinforcing social hierarchies. Who controlled the fire, who had access, and who wandered unlit in shadows. You probably wouldn't survive a night without acute attention, because a single misstep could land you in mud, water, or worse. As you approach the town square, you notice a group of villagers gathered around a small fire. They're telling stories, a mix of local gossip, heroic tales, and warnings about the supernatural. You join quietly, listening as a man recounts how a wandering spirit cursed a farmer for failing to respect sacred boundaries. Fringe historians argue that these tales were moral lessons disguised as entertainment, a blend of fear, humor, and social instruction. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these stories because knowledge, whether superstition or fact, could save your life in the dark. A child runs past, carrying a lantern too heavy for their small hands, giggling with delight. You remember your own cautious navigation of the marketplace earlier, and you marvel at how much balance, awareness, and quick reflexes are required just to stay upright and avoid calamity. Historians still debate whether children learned survival skills organically or were forced into them by necessity, but it's clear the former required equal parts daring and luck. Fringe historians add that childhood games often doubled as covert training for dangerous tasks adults expected them to master. You notice a woman setting out a small offering of bread and milk at the edge of her garden, murmuring a prayer to saints or spirits you don't fully understand. Fringe historians claim these rituals might have been protective, a blend of faith and tradition aimed at safeguarding livestock, crops, or family health. You probably wouldn't survive the night ignoring such practices because every precaution, even superstition, was taken seriously. As darkness deepens, the sounds of nocturnal creatures rise. Owls calling, cats prowling, and a distant wolf's howl slicing through the air. You trudge more carefully now, trying to avoid puddles, piles of refuse, and unseen obstacles. Historians still argue whether the fear of wild animals was justified or exaggerated by storytelling, but you already feel the tension in every step. Fringe historians point out that even domesticated animals could pose threats at night, from tripping humans to spreading disease. You pass the village well, its waters glinting in the flickering torchlight. Someone warns that the well is sacred and that careless dipping or failing to offer a small token could invoke misfortune. You remember reading about wells and springs being both vital resources and loci of superstition. You probably wouldn't survive a night ignoring such warnings because cultural norms were intertwined with practical survival measures. Disrespect could lead to confrontation, ostracism, or worse.
A small group of men patrol the perimeter, keeping an eye out for thieves, wolves, or wandering spirits. You notice that even at night, social vigilance continues, blending practicality and superstition. Historians still debate whether these patrols were effective crime deterrents or largely symbolic displays of order, but observing them makes you appreciate the constant alertness required just to exist in this world. French historians suggest that some night watches doubled as informal law enforcement, education in the dangers of disobedience, and even storytelling opportunities. You finally reach your sleeping quarters, a modest room with straw-covered flooring and a thin blanket.
Exhaustion seeps into your limbs, but your mind races, replaying the day's lessons: hygiene, labor, law, commerce, medicine, and courtly intrigue. Each aspect of medieval life required vigilance, adaptability, and courage. You probably wouldn't survive a day without some combination of cunning, humility, and luck. Yet, despite the discomfort and danger, there's a strange rhythm to it all, a sense of resilience, community, and life lived fully in ways your modern self has rarely encountered. You lie down, listening to the distant sounds of the village settling for the night, the clatter of a goat pen, soft snores, and the occasional laugh or scolding from neighbors. Fringe historians argue that nighttime offered both rest and the quiet reinforcement of social norms, a period for reflection and subtle observation. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these subtle lessons, and as your eyelids grow heavy, you realize that understanding this world requires more than just physical endurance. It demands awareness, humility, and a willingness to adapt.
By the first hour of night, your body aches, your mind spins with the day's chaotic lessons, and the village around you has fallen into a muted rhythm. Lanterns flicker along the streets, illuminating the mud in a ghostly glow, while distant dogs bark at unseen nocturnal intruders. You trudge carefully, remembering everything you've seen: filth, labor, law, market chaos, medical rituals, courtly intrigue, and the delicate balance of superstition and survival. Historians still argue whether villagers feared the night more than necessary, or whether darkness genuinely amplified the dangers of medieval life. But your instincts warn you that even a small misstep could have cascading consequences. You pause outside a stable, watching a farmer tend to horses. The animals snort and shuffle their hooves, each movement stirring dust and manure into the cool evening air. Fringe historians suggest that tending livestock after dark was one of the most perilous tasks, requiring alertness, agility, and intimate knowledge of the animals' temperaments. You probably wouldn't survive a night in this village without careful attention to the smallest details, from shifting shadows to the clink of harnesses. A group of villagers sits around a dying fire, quietly talking about rumors of thieves, spirits, and wandering nobles. You edge closer, listening without participating. The way they speak blends caution with storytelling, humor with superstition. Historians still debate whether these nightly gatherings primarily reinforced social bonds or served as a vehicle for spreading fear and control. But watching the interactions, you understand that survival in the medieval world depended as much on social awareness as physical endurance. Fringe historians note that such gatherings often served as informal intelligence networks, a way for villagers to warn one another of threats, both human and supernatural. You move onward, stepping lightly across uneven cobblestones, avoiding puddles that glint under torchlight like hidden traps. You notice a child crouched near a doorway, pretending to be asleep to avoid a parent's wrath or a prank from older children. You remember the marketplace, the courts, and the rigorous labor of the day, realizing that even the youngest villagers learned early to navigate danger. You probably wouldn't survive a day if your awareness didn't match the environment, and this night reinforces that lesson vividly. Passing the apothecary's hut, you catch the faint smell of herbs and tinctures. Even at night, some villagers make their rounds, preparing remedies or tending to the sick. Fringe historians argue about the effectiveness of nocturnal care, suggesting that attentiveness after dark was as much about superstition and ritual as it was about practical medicine. You probably wouldn't survive encountering a healer alone in a dark alley without a healthy dose of caution. Yet observing the ritual reminds you of the delicate balance between fear and hope that structured medieval life. You notice occasional patrols, guards moving silently along the perimeter of the village, ensuring that wandering animals, thieves, or other dangers are kept at bay. Their eyes flick constantly, scanning for anomalies in shadows and movement. Historians still debate the efficacy of these night watches versus their symbolic reassurance of order. But for you, every step is a lesson in vigilance. Fringe historians claim that the psychological impact of seeing patrols at night may have been as important as their actual enforcement, instilling caution and respect among villagers and visitors alike.
Reaching your sleeping quarters, you notice the faint rustle of animals in nearby pens and the occasional creak of wood as the wind stirs doors and windows. You carefully settle onto the straw-covered floor, pulling your thin blanket close. Every day in this world is physically exhausting, mentally taxing, and socially complex. You probably wouldn't survive without learning to integrate observation, caution, and humility into every step, gesture, and thought. Yet, amidst the harshness, there is resilience, community, and adaptation that is nothing short of remarkable. As the night deepens, the village quiets further. Only the occasional cough, the whisper of fabric against skin, or the distant cry of an animal breaks the near silence. Fringe historians suggest that nocturnal life offered both danger and reflection, a time for consolidation, planning, and storytelling. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these rhythms, because the medieval world demanded constant interaction between awareness and action. You close your eyes, letting your mind replay the day's lessons. Navigating filth, surviving labor, respecting laws, reading social cues, handling medical risks, and observing courtly intrigue. Each sensory detail, the smell, the texture, the sounds, and the subtle social dances remains vivid. You probably wouldn't survive a day in this world unprepared, but you've glimpsed the extraordinary endurance, adaptability, and inventiveness of people who thrived under conditions that would leave modern humans overwhelmed and exhausted. As the night folds fully into darkness, you finally allow yourself to rest, knowing that tomorrow will bring new challenges, yet feeling the quiet satisfaction of having survived, observed, and understood more than you ever expected. Even in the harshest conditions, life pulses with resilience, community, and the human capacity to endure.
The night stretches slowly around you, softening every sharp edge of the day's harsh lessons. You feel the straw beneath you, uneven and scratchy, yet strangely grounding. Outside, the village has quieted to a gentle hum, a dog's distant bark, the whisper of wind through the trees, and the occasional creak of a door settling in its frame. Each sound is a reminder that life continues, quietly, persistently, and without fanfare. You let yourself sink into this rhythm, feeling the tension in your muscles slowly ease. You recall the sun-baked streets, the relentless labor, and the mud-caked cobblestones. Each memory is vivid, yet your breathing slows as the exhaustion of the day merges with the soothing patterns of night. Even the more frightening moments, the healer's leeches, the courtly glances, and the marketplace chaos, begin to soften in your mind, reduced to lessons in observation and adaptability rather than fear. Fringe historians suggest that remembering hardship in a reflective way may have been as important for survival as the work itself, and you feel that resonance now, lying still with your thoughts settling like dust. The smells of the day fade into the night, the pungent tang of smoke and animal, the earthy perfume of damp soil, and faint hints of herbs lingering in the air.
Each inhalation reminds you that this world was lived with full awareness of sensation, every sense tuned to danger, comfort, and opportunity alike. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more attuned to their environment out of necessity or culture, but you feel that heightened awareness now, lying still with your thoughts settling like dust. Your limbs relax further, and the memories of social rules, market chaos, and the rigid hierarchy of the noble court drift into a calm narrative. You recognize a strange beauty in the patterns of life you've witnessed, the rhythmic labor in the fields, the subtle diplomacy in the court, the interplay of superstition and practicality, and the enduring vigilance required in even the simplest tasks. Fringe historians sometimes call this the art of survival, and lying here, you begin to understand why. You probably wouldn't survive a day unprepared for these rhythms, yet observing them from this quiet vantage point gives a sense of clarity and respect. The night deepens, and with it comes a gentle mental release. You imagine the villagers settling into sleep, each with their own routines, worries, and small comforts. Some drift off with dreams of bread or livestock, others with thoughts of tomorrow's chores, and yet all share a resilience you cannot help but admire. Your own breath synchronizes with the imagined pulse of the village, slow, steady, unbroken. Historians still debate whether rest itself was structured or improvised, yet the consistency of it, this universal pause, feels profoundly reassuring. You allow your imagination to drift along with the fading sounds, a fire crackling, the sway of a lantern, a distant owl taking flight. Each fragment of the day collapses gently into memory. You remember the lessons, the grimy streets, the laborious work, the unpredictable market, the healer's rituals, and the careful maneuvering of social hierarchies without tension or fear, only acknowledgement. Fringe historians suggest that reflection and storytelling were key to processing hardship, a meditation that bridged survival and human experience. You feel that now, letting the lessons mingle with your senses and imagination.
Your eyelids grow heavier, each breath deeper, more rhythmic. The village, once overwhelming in its complexity, now feels like a living organism, steady and enduring, teaching patience and observation in ways that modern life rarely demands. You probably wouldn't survive a day without vigilance, adaptability, and careful attention. Yet now, in this quiet, you find that the world seems less intimidating, more coherent, and strangely comforting. The air around you is still, the night sounds softer, more melodic. You imagine tomorrow's sunrise washing over mud-slick streets, over bustling markets, and over quiet fields, and a sense of continuity settles in. Life is relentless, exhausting, sometimes strange, and often uncomfortable, but also resilient, communal, and remarkably inventive. You feel gratitude for having witnessed even a fraction of it, letting your mind settle into the rhythm of human endurance and ingenuity. Now you drift toward sleep, your awareness fading gently, letting the lessons of the day coexist with calmness and quiet reflection. The village sleeps, the night deepens, and you too are finally allowed to rest. Sweet dreams of cobblestones, leeches, markets, and quiet resilience weave through your mind, a lullaby written in the textures, smells, and rhythms of a world you probably wouldn't survive, but can now appreciate.
End of script. Sweet dreams.